Okay, colleagues, so hello and welcome back. Now, this is going to be another one of those stream of consciousness, unstructured videos, just sharing thoughts in my head. So the topic I have in mind right now is skepticism, especially in relation to what I call sometimes my quote-unquote 3 basic rules of method. So how skepticism is intrinsic and really essential to doing philosophy, and how at the same time skepticism seems to be somewhat problematic from the general political or maybe ethical standpoint. So I guess I want to talk about my quote-unquote 3 rules of method, which are provisionally I would call fallibilism, skepticism, and empiricism. And then to try to tie this to politics, I want to elaborate a little bit on John Stuart Mill's classical defense of freedom of speech, which in some sense turns this political problem of skepticism on its head, and Mill is basically trying to say that skepticism is not only a good thing, but in the advanced stages of social development, skepticism and freedom of speech are actually necessary for a proper functioning of society. So parenthetically, let me just say this is not scripted, so I'm not sure how coherent this is going to be, but I feel like I need to think these issues through before the beginning of the year. Again, in a previous video called Socrates, Descartes, and the Challenge of Relativism, I mentioned that I'm not really satisfied with Socrates' defense, and since broadly speaking I am in the similar line of business, and potentially open to the similar kinds of accusations, I want to try in a preliminary fashion to make my own defense in the name of myself and in the name of philosophy. Although again, this is a draft of that defense. So with that in mind, let's proceed. So let me start with the quote-unquote my 3 rules of method. So the 3 rules are, I'm still looking for the best words to summarize them, but let's say fallibilism, skepticism, and empiricism. In a general way, I think that these rules do capture certain basic presuppositions of my thinking that I've had more or less since the time I started doing philosophy seriously. Let's say in 2005, 2006 maybe, so on the order of 15 years. But this particular formulation, in terms of these 3 specific rules, came to me, as far as I remember, rather spontaneously, as I was thinking through the first course I ever taught as my own course, as a lecturer, philosophy of science. This was maybe 5 years ago, approximately. So, to unpack the rules a little bit. Fallibilism. My use of this word definitely goes back to a series of lectures by Rick Roderick, an American philosopher who sadly passed away not long ago. He has several wonderful lecture courses, originally recorded by the Teaching Company, also known as the Great Courses, but now these courses are very old, so I think they are available freely online. Wonderful courses. I have a lot of happy memories listening to them. Rick is a very passionate and a very inspiring speaker, although I have to say, very, very disorganized. Now, I would be the last person to criticize Rick for this, but if you plan on listening to his lectures, do not go in expecting something like a meticulous, scholastic summary of the views that he is presenting. So, just to take one example, I think in a lecture on Heidegger, he talks more about Ronald Reagan than he does about Heidegger. Ronald Reagan and fascism, yeah. Anyway, I hope me spending a minute to talk about this will inspire at least some of you to go and look at his lectures. Not my first recommendation for somebody who's just starting to do philosophy, or somebody who is looking to increase their grade on an exam. But for more serious and more advanced students, I mean, Rick Roderick is like he deserves his own category. One of the courses that had a life-changing impact on my thinking. Sorry, digressions. Back on track. So, fallibilism is, I think, technically defined in a textbook fashion as an assertion that no proposition can be justified completely in an apodictic fashion, if you want. Some people may be tempted to say, but hey, what about logic? And logic is an interesting case. But following David Hume and John Stuart Mill, I personally take a psychologist view of logic, in the sense that, at the end of the day, logical and mathematical propositions can convince us psychologically, but we cannot really guarantee 100% that they are true. And although obviously one should not expect simple, straightforward knockdown arguments in topics as sophisticated and complicated as philosophy of logic and mathematics, but still, I think I can give a very straightforward, a very vivid example. Remember when we were children, how we first did basic arithmetic? You do a calculation in class, and you are certain, you are well assured of the result. Psychological certainty, psychological certainty. But then your classmate or your teacher points out, oh look, you forgot a minus sign, or something like that. And you see, you were sure, but then it turns out you were wrong. So I would say, in this infuriatingly skeptical fashion, yeah, we have a broad consensus that 1 plus 1 is equal to 2. But at the end of the day, qualitatively, it's the same thing as handing in your paper at the end of the test, being sure that everything you wrote there is correct. By the way, as an aside, a sidetrack of a sidetrack, let me just mention, 1 plus 1 is equal to 2, that's a very simple result. But think of the proof of Fermat's last theorem. Not sure if I should go into any detail on what that is, but it was an important unsolved problem in contemporary mathematics, proven by a British mathematician, Sir Andrew Wiles, in 1995. Not to talk complete gibberish, I guess the simplest explanation of what Fermat's last theorem deals with is if you imagine Pythagoras' theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So the idea is that if you are looking for positive integer solutions, you can do this for squares, like 3 squared plus 4 squared is equal to 5 squared. But if you want to take a higher power, like cubes or the power of 4 or the power of 5, there are no positive integer solutions. Why the hell am I talking about this? I don't know. Apologies. Back to the video. So the point I was trying to make is that Fermat's last theorem is a very important result, I suppose, in both mathematics and logic, but the proof by Andrew Wiles is more than 100 pages long. And as Kane Baker points out, so let me continue these sidetracks of sidetracks. I'm sure many people right now are having PTSD flashbacks of how my lectures get derailed very often. How I end up wasting most of class talking about something completely random. Well, I've said this. The standard for these videos is that they should be no worse than what I do in class. I don't know, maybe this is fun, I don't know. I promise to bring this back on track in a second. So, Kane Baker is a graduate student in philosophy of science, if I'm not mistaken. And he does wonderful, academic, meticulous overviews of questions, mostly in and around analytical philosophy. So, complete opposite of Rick Roderick in many ways, but a strong recommendation if you're trying to brush up for the exam, or if you're writing a paper or something. So, this thought is not original to Kane Baker, but he is the one who alerted my attention to this. Again, the proof of Fermat's last theorem is more than 100 pages long. How do we know that it is a valid proof? And how do we know, for sure, 100%, that there isn't some mistake that we simply fail to have spotted? So I hope you can see how this ties in with this general question of fallibilism. No conclusion can be known with complete certainty. Even proven theorems in math and logic could, in principle, turn out to be wrong if they contain some logical error, for example, that has simply been overlooked by other people who are doing the checking. Not to mention that a lot of things simply cannot be proven at all. In fact, if my understanding of Gödel's incompleteness theorem is broadly speaking, correct, actually none of the really important mathematical theorems can be proven conclusively, in the sense that we always need to rely on assumptions which themselves cannot be proven. So Gödel's incompleteness theorem is definitely a topic for another video, but just not to leave this hanging in the air. I think its formulation is: any system of logic that is rich enough to provide a basis for arithmetic, so any rich enough logical system, will necessarily contain propositions which cannot be justified within that system. Therefore, we'll have to take them as unproven assumptions. So I'm not really an expert on this, but I've always taken Gödel's incompleteness theorem as proving that in a deep sense, logic or mathematics cannot prove itself. And while we're at it, there's also the famous problem of deduction, which in my head is associated with the name of Wittgenstein, but I don't really have a reference at the top of my head. I suppose the classical formulation of the problem of deduction goes back before Wittgenstein to Lewis Carroll, better known as the author of Alice in Wonderland. But he also wrote this very important article, What the Tortoise Said to Achilles, which, again, as far as I know, presents one of the classical expositions of the problem of deduction. Don't really want to go into this right now, but it's a problem of following rules. Namely, if you need a rule to follow a rule, like if you follow rules according to other rules, then you run into an infinite regress. I'm sure the problem of deduction, one way or another, has to go to ancient skeptics and the ancient skeptical problem of criterion. But again, all of this for another day. Now, all of this has to do with, so to speak, the formal side of fallibilism. Again, this idea that no belief can be completely justified. But for me, there's also an informal side, in the sense that throughout my own personal philosophical development, as I became more self-conscious, as I became more self-aware of my own thought processes, parenthetically, something that yoga and meditation helped me with a lot. Again, topic for another day. So as I became more self-aware, I started noticing how very often, when faced with a particular question, or let's say some piece of news, my mind would immediately rush to some conclusion. And obviously, I started noticing this at a particular moment of time as a result of reflection and meditation, but surely I have been doing this all my life. And in fact, although this surely kind of sounds like a grandiose claim, but in fact, as far as I can tell, the vast majority of people in their everyday life operate in a very similar fashion. As Nobel Prize winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman says, the human mind, is a machine for jumping to conclusions. So you see a question, like what to do with global warming, or you're asked to evaluate some political event, or let's say your friend asks you for advice, like lifestyle advice, or maybe advice about diet or exercise or depression. And it's like there's this immediate urge to give an authoritative answer. And I mean, as soon as I started noticing this, it became abundantly clear that, of course, most of the time, my own conclusions that I jumped to, and the conclusions of other people, these first knee-jerk type conclusions, they are very often completely wrong. Now, obviously, there are certain circumstances where you need to take the decision immediately on the spot, like if you're in the middle of a road and there's a truck rushing towards you. This is no time to be philosophical and ask yourself, Cartesian questions. Like, is there really a truck rushing towards me? Or maybe there's an evil demon who just makes me think that there's an evil truck rushing towards me. Or maybe I'm asleep. The regular philosophical questions. But surely, there's a whole huge class of problems, like who to vote for in the next election, or which profession to choose, or whom to marry, or whether to have children, Or, even such mundane things as the best diet and exercise program. Surely there's a fair amount of time to pause and reflect, to consider the alternatives. And in most of these cases, there's also a possibility to reconsider. Like you vote for somebody, and then you decide you're not going to support them in the next election. Or you start on this diet plan, and then you switch to a different one. Again, these are very mundane, very pedestrian, Mickey Mouse questions. It feels very banal to talk about these things. But in a certain sense, I do want to keep the discussion kind of artificially simple. Because I think the biggest questions this applies to are questions of politics. I'm a political philosopher by trade. And in my course, Philosophy of Science, I present what I think is a very robust conclusion of our contemporary scientific worldview, broadly speaking. And that conclusion is that the domain of highest complexity in the entire observable universe, throughout the history of the entire observable universe, the domain of highest complexity, defined rigorously and quantitatively, basically is the domain of social and political theory. So physics is the simplest science. American physicist Sean Carroll explains this very well in his latest book, Something Deeply Hidden. So physics is the simplest science, then chemistry is more complicated, builds on top of physics, then biology is more complicated than chemistry, and I think it has been firmly established that within the domain of biology, the most complex structures have to do with the process of cognition, broadly defined. So something like the brain is the most complex organ in all of biology. And human brains appear to be the most complex of all the animals around. So again, as far as I can tell, a single individual human brain is objectively, quantitatively more complex than the Milky Way galaxy, at least. And then, of course, human brains don't exist in isolation. Human brains interact with a particular social system, and they change and evolve as a result of this interaction. So if the brain is so beyond astronomically complex, then the system of brains is even more complex. And so, by this measure, a system of systems, so something like the domain of international relations, that would be the most complex. So congratulations, international relations students. You are studying objectively the most complex subject in all of sciences. Congratulations. Now, a couple caveats. I am fairly certain that the story I have just given you, I have not phrased it in a completely rigorous fashion. So I think the conclusion stands. It's just that, technically speaking, I'm pretty sure I need to clean up my vocabulary from a technical standpoint. Second caveat, to be completely pedantic, I'm saying that international politics is the most complicated system, most complex system observable by us, but obviously one could imagine some kind of alien species, or maybe an intergalactic federation of many different alien species that would be even more complex, or something else in that direction. But of the things that we can observe right now, IR takes the first prize in terms of complexity. And so again, to go back to this issue of fallibilism, if we think about these big political issues, especially international political issues, like global warming, or capitalism versus socialism, or democracy versus bureaucracy, or the viability and the feasibility of world communism, all of these issues cannot possibly admit of a simple, straightforward, one-line, knockdown solution. And this is the kind of complexity that people so often find intolerable, for the lack of a better word. Now, I'm obviously playing with fire giving this example, but capitalism versus socialism. It seems that everybody has an immediate answer. Very straightforward, no questions about it. one mode of social organization is right and good and just and proper, and the other one is horrible, inefficient, violent, and tyrannical. All good, proper, decent people agree, and everybody who disagrees is either a monster or a madman. Trouble is, of course, that you have huge number of people on both sides, including a huge number of careful, sophisticated, profound philosophers. That is the kind of issue where one should, at all cost, avoid the temptation of jumping to a conclusion. And of course, after a certain amount of reflection, one needs to come to some conclusion. But this conclusion has to be tentative, provisional, open to revision. That's how thinking works. That's what it means to think seriously, and not just shout slogans in a knee-jerk fashion. Is this getting a bit too controversial? Am I controversial right now? I don't know. Should I preemptively invite everyone to take everything I've just said with a grain of salt? I don't know. I mean, this whole video is about skepticism and fallibilism. Should you be fallibilist about fallibilism and skeptical about skepticism? Yeah, sounds about right. Anyway, 20 minutes into the video, let's proceed to the second rule. So again, fallibilism, skepticism, and empiricism. The second one is skepticism. Now in my head, the second rule goes back to John Searle, wonderful American philosopher from the University of California, Berkeley. He's still alive, but I think he's so old now, he's completely retired. No new books or no new lectures from him. Again, his courses, freely available online. So he has this phrase that to be a philosopher, one needs to have this skill of being able to question the assumptions that any sane person takes for granted. Searle says, when you begin philosophical inquiry, you need to learn to be like a child, to ask the most naive questions. Why is the sky blue? Why does 1 + 1 = 2? Why do people in the street behave in such orderly fashion? Now this is also definitely related to an important philosophical practice in contemporary sociology, in phenomenology. In modern times, goes back to Edmund Husserl. In ancient times, goes back to Sextus Empiricus. So Husserl, I think fairly explicitly following Sextus, uses this phrase, in Greek epoche, bracketing out, sometimes called phenomenological reduction. So bracketing out the taken for granted assumptions. Phenomenologically speaking, trying to approach the world without making any assumptions whatsoever. Now, I'm not sure if the word skepticism is the most appropriate in this context. So again, I'm talking about fallibilism, skepticism, and empiricism. Now, I have chosen the word skepticism because skeptikos in Greek means inquirer. Skeptics, so to speak, never stop searching for the truth. So I suppose you can be a fallibilist without being an inquirer. So the first rule and the second rule are different in this sense. And the second rule invites us in this highly skeptical fashion to try to examine all of our assumptions and presuppositions as much as possible. And I talk in my other video on the 3 rules of method, the short 10-minute summary, I talk about how actually this is extremely hard to do. I mean, we see the world is intelligible to us, actually only through the prism of our assumptions. So it's hard, if not impossible, to see something through which you see anything else. So it's like if you're a fish, the one thing that you do not notice is water. If you wear glasses, the one thing that you do not normally notice is glasses. I mean, these are imperfect analogies, but I do think that the conclusion stands. It is very difficult, I would say ultimately impossible, to question all of our assumptions, especially to question them all the time. So that's why I like to call this second rule skepticism. Again, skeptikos is somebody who continues the inquiry as much as possible. And so we have this colossal enterprise, a Sisyphean enterprise, as a matter of fact. We try as much as possible to push the boulder uphill, to question as many of our assumptions as we can and as deeply as we can, but then necessarily we wake up in the morning and we have to rush to class or to a meeting or something, and we forget all this skeptical stuff. The Sisyphean boulder rolls downhill, and in the evening we go back to our study, take off our clothes of the day, and begin to roll the philosophical boulder uphill back again. Maybe there's more to say about the second rule, but this is the state of my thinking right now, so let me move on. The third rule is empiricism. Now, I don't know, this is such a huge topic that I'm kind of tempted to simply issue an IOU that will do another video, or probably another 10 or 20 videos on various empiricist philosophers, various forms of empiricism, various criticisms of empiricism, and counter-criticisms, etc., etc. Honestly, don't know what I can say here. I am a committed empiricist. All of our knowledge necessarily comes from experience and has to be held accountable before the high court of experience. And yes, experience is unreliable. Experience is the worst teacher. But the only way we know that experience is unreliable is by comparing one experience to another. The only way we know that experience is the worst teacher is by trying to extract lessons from experience and future experience demonstrating our failure. So, to paraphrase Churchill, apologies for such low-brow jokes. Experience is the worst teacher, except for all others. So yeah, at the end of the day, we're stuck with empiricism, I think. There are serious modern philosophers who want to go beyond empiricism one way or another. I mean, since ancient times, since at least Plato, there are always forms of rationalism or idealism. But let me tell you, I am not convinced. I stand firmly by David Hume. Okay, what does all of this have to do with politics? Now, this is already a fairly long video, so I'll try to be brief. And as I promised, I'm going to talk about John Stuart Mill. I do plan to record a shorter, more focused video devoted specifically to Mill at a later time. But I think I can give the basic rundown here. So as I keep talking in other videos, there's this problem between philosophy and politics. Philosophy is skeptical, and politics requires loyalty. Philosophy asks one to step back and to think, to contemplate. Politics very often requires one to act here and now. Philosophy invites us to question. Politics very often demands that we have faith. So one prima facie way to resolve this conflict is through John Stuart Mill's version of liberalism. Now, I like John Stuart Mill's picture a lot, and on my optimistic days, I hope that Mill is accurately painting the future for humanity. On my pessimistic days, a topic for another video, I'm afraid that we are devolving towards self-destruction, or maybe, alternatively, we are doomed to coalesce into something like hive mind. Again, talk about this some other time. But on Mill's optimistic picture, and I think its greatest contemporary supporter would be Jürgen Habermas, Mill has this notion that the most important value in human life, all of human life, including ethics and politics, the most important value is truth. Now, Mill is a skeptic and an empiricist, so humans do not really have any kind of straightforward, unproblematic access to the truth with a capital T. But what we can try to do is to have a free and open discussion. Now, Mill also importantly points out that not everybody can have this discussion, and we need a certain level of historical and social development, and also, I think, a certain level of peace and prosperity. I cannot really imagine free and open discussion at the times of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta. And I think if Mill saw the Second World War, maybe, very plausibly, he would have to go back on his assertion that the leading countries in the world, Mill is talking about Britain primarily, has irrevocably reached this stage where people are capable of being improved through a free and equal discussion. Not necessarily because people are irrational, but because desperate times call for desperate measures. This is obviously a very complicated and a highly controversial topic, so all of this tentatively, hypothetically, with a question mark. But still, to go back to Mill's main point, the basic precondition of all human well-being is mental well-being, as Mill says. So basically, again, access to truth, which we get through a free and equal discussion. So we have something like a marketplace of ideas where all views are allowed, complete, unrestricted freedom of speech, no censorship or anything like that. There are some caveats about other regarding actions I don't want to discuss right now. And I don't really think they're critical, but just to be on the safe side, let me mention that there's this complication. And Mill advances 4 basic arguments in support of his position, or he discusses 4 basic scenarios. He says one possibility is that the opinion that we are trying to censor is actually true. So take your favorite historical example, Copernicus or Galileo, or maybe Hans Semmelweis, a philosopher or a scientist, proclaims something that we consider true today, but in his or her own time, they are censored, persecuted, or maybe even killed. Mill says, let the 1,000 flowers bloom. The best theory will be left standing at the end of the day, in a free and open competition in the marketplace of ideas. We cannot assume our own infallibility, so Mill is deeply committed to fallibilism. My first rule of method in this video. And that's why every opinion has to be allowed. The second scenario Mill discusses is that imagine the opinion is false. Let's say a proposition that the earth is flat, or a proposition that vaccines cause autism, or some racist or sexist proposition. Mill says, even if the view that you are trying to censor is wrong, it is still much better to not censor it, because it is only by having a free and equal discussion, it is only by the quote-unquote correct view clashing with the opposing ideas that we can establish the truth or get closer to the truth. So again, it is only against the background of the best arguments that the earth is flat that we can really establish that the earth is round. It is only by considering the best arguments in favor of vaccines being harmful that we can establish safety of vaccines. Let me parenthetically note that especially those of my students who are going to write on the University of London exam, this is very much the ethos of the University of London. When you are criticizing a given view, you need to first try to give the best possible defense of that view. Only then can you consider yourself knowledgeable on the issue. So only by knowing the best arguments on the other side, and only by coming up with the best counter-arguments to them, can we say that we do hold our beliefs rationally and not as mere prejudice. Now, I realize I botched this a little bit. This is an unscripted video, and I'm doing this from memory. So the 4 scenarios that Mill discusses are that the opinion that you are trying to censor is true, then of course don't censor it. Second, maybe it's not completely true, but at least partially true. And so by combining 2 partially true opinions, we get closer to the truth. And Mill says opinions are very rarely either completely false or completely true. Now the third scenario is that the opinion that you're trying to censor is completely false, but it's still useful because it helps you to come up with the best arguments for the quote-unquote true opinions, the opinions that we provisionally accept as true. And argument number 4 has to do with the sincerity of one's conviction. Mill talks about religion, how if everyone's a Christian, nobody's a Christian, something like that. A highly controversial and a volatile example I could give would be an analogy about racism or sexism. So only by allowing racist and sexist ideas to circulate, and only by engaging racist and sexist ideas in a free and equal discussion, can we truly consider ourselves to be committed to gender or racial equality, and not just hold these views of gender and racial equality as blind, thoughtless prejudice. I think the nuance of Mill's example may be slightly different. So I think he's talking about motivation to perform certain actions with sincere and heartfelt conviction, as opposed to simply going through the motions. But maybe it's similar enough. I don't know. We'll discuss this later. So how does any of this answer the challenge against Socrates, the challenge against philosophy? Again, I think that Mill would not deny that patriotism and loyalty and civic faith could play an important role in politics, broadly speaking. However, at the end of the day, the best way to arrange a social and political system is not by reliance on blind faith and unwavering loyalty, but to build upon understanding and rational consensus. Something that in my own head I would identify with Jürgen Habermas's conception of communicative rationality. Again, to use Rick Roderick's phrase, that the only force that a free citizen recognizes is the peculiarly unforced force of the better argument. Now, I think it's a beautiful picture, and it's also a very self-serving picture, because on Mill's view, the best people in all of society are the philosophers. The best, that is, most useful, but also the most patriotic. Anyway, as I said, on my optimistic days, I am myself a huge fan of this highly self-serving picture. But on my pessimistic days, I begin to ask questions about it. Like, for example, Mill's society seems nice, but is it also efficient? Is it efficient at fighting wars? Is it efficient at spreading its ideology? Would a Millian liberal be able to convert a religious fanatic, for example? And other problems of this sort. So, broadly speaking, my concerns with Mill have to do with this evolutionary line of thinking. So if we imagine social political systems in competition with one another, if we imagine something like cultural selection, can this Millian-style liberal democracy survive this kind of competition? Or would other cultural models or social systems, more authoritarian, less tolerant, more uniform, would these systems have some kind of an edge on the arena of cultural selection? I honestly don't have an answer. In fact, I'd say that this is the biggest unsolved philosophical issue that occupies me these days. Definitely one of the biggest. So in terms of history, I think time will tell. But I also think that we can greatly simplify the problem by talking not about societies, but about individuals. And I think in the case of individuals, especially the kinds of individuals that have the means and the leisure to engage in philosophy. My first-year students, for example. So from the standpoint of the individual, I don't think that there's any question or any deep problem. As Jerry Cohen says, I think, whether you will philosophize or won't philosophize, you must philosophize. Either you think for yourself or others think for you. Now, just through random luck, it could be that these others know best what's good for you, but unless you think for yourself, and unless you try by yourself to verify the guidelines that other people or culture more broadly is suggesting to you, so unless you verify these guidelines for yourself, there's no rational reason to suppose that they're right. I mean, you might as well flip a coin and let that be a guide to your action. I don't think that this is like a knockdown argument, but I do think that it resonates very deeply with first-year students, who, after all, are trying to take their own life under control, often for the very first time. And philosophy in general, and this kind of fallibilist, skeptical, relativist philosophy that I am peddling here, maybe could do a lot of damage. But if John Stuart Mill is right, the alternative is even worse. Yes, we have to allow all ideas to be considered, no matter how abhorrent or how obviously false we think they are. And this is, I guess, my ultimate defense. Thinking can be dangerous, but not thinking could be even more dangerous. Sounds like a nice note to finish on. Though this is definitely not the last time we'll be discussing these issues. So I guess I'll see you around. And as always, take care.